Welcome to the Tank Podcast. In this week's episode, historian Faisal Devji traces the root causes of the endless wars in Western Asia, from Palestine to Tehran.
Responding to the report of a British Royal Commission recommending the partition of Palestine in 1937, the Indian poet and philosopher Muhammad Iqbal saw in the impending establishment of a Jewish national home there a consequence of the Arabs, quote, deserting the Turks in their hour of trial. His reference to the Arab revolt against Ottoman rule during the First World War did not represent some pan-Islamic nostalgia for a lost caliphate that Iqbal had never supported. Like many of his compatriots, Hindu and Muslim, he was concerned rather with how Arab nationalism naively set the Middle East up for European rule. Iqbal was in fact a critic of nationalism, which he saw as inherently violent and the force behind modern imperialism. Unlike countries like Iqbal's own India, where nationalism arose after and against colonialism, in places like the Levant, it showed its contradictory rather than merely liberating character by preceding and indeed making way for European empires. Now, this had to some degree also been the case for the Balkan territories that had freed themselves from Ottoman rule before the Great War. But many of them had powerful protectors in rival empires like the Russian, whose competitive relations with their British, French, German or Austro-Hungarian peers allowed these new states a measure of autonomy and eventually independence. The Arabs enjoyed no such advantage and have remained in a state of dependency as Iqbal predicted. The region's political integrity, Iqbal thought, was to be guaranteed not by the emergence of petty nation states, but only by a great power such as the Ottomans had been, with the Arabs likely better able to have negotiated their autonomy with the defeated Turks than the victorious British and French who replaced them. Experience, he therefore said, quote, has made it abundantly clear that the political integrity of the peoples of the Near East lies in the immediate reunion of the Turks and the Arabs. Not the resurrection of the Ottoman Empire, but some kind of regional rather than national political arrangement was crucial for the future of the Middle East, something he thought could be as little secured by pan-Arabism as it had been by pan-Islamism. For Iqbal and many other Muslims outside the Middle East, the Palestinian problem was thus as much a product of Arab nationalism as of British colonialism. For even if they were to become independent in the future, these new states were too small and powerless to exercise sovereignty over the region and could in fact only deprive it of stability by their mutual fears and competition. The fate Iqbal predicted for the Middle East was, he thought, already evident in the proposal for a Jewish national home in Palestine, which he said would in fact be nothing more than a home for British imperialism in a permanent mandate. Had he lived longer, Iqbal would no doubt have argued that America only came to replace Britain in this role. He said, far from being a solution of the British problem in the Mediterranean, the founding of a Jewish national home was, quote, really the beginning of the future difficulties of British imperialism. Equally prescient was his statement that the Arabs, quote, must further remember that they cannot afford to rely on the advice of those Arab kings who are not in a position to arrive at an independent judgment in the matter of Palestine with an independent conscience. Already a globally celebrated Muslim thinker in his own lifetime, Iqbal was not alone in his deep suspicion of Arab nationalism and indeed of the Arab state itself as a political form lacking sovereignty from its very inception. It represented for him the malign side of nationalism more generally. Such critical views of Arab states interestingly do not distinguish between their institutional or ideological forms. Prevalent among non-Arab Muslims in particular, these views derive in part from a mixture of resentment at those who claim Islam as their cultural inheritance and the embarrassment of seeing its would-be heirs so powerless. But these prejudices are also paired with a keen recognition that Arab states have never enjoyed sovereignty. Many of them moved from Ottoman to European rule after the First World War and to American stewardship after the Second, with the Cold War's great power competition eventually allowing some to claim autonomy for themselves. but the ideological states of the Cold War, from Nasser's Egypt and Gaddafi's Libya to Ba'athist Syria and Iraq or communist Yemen, were dismantled largely by external force in its aftermath. And with these ostensibly revolutionary republics all over the Middle East weakened or destroyed, the conservative and capitalist monarchies of the Persian Gulf came to the fore as the region's chief political actors. Though each relies on American protection and none has successfully fielded an army in battle, these states have the financial resources to fight proxy wars with each other through insurgents and mercenaries. Their very lack of sovereignty permits them to perform its simulacrum under the US security umbrella. A country like the UAE is much like Israel in this respect, small and dependent for its security on the US, but, perhaps for this very reason, willing to exercise military force across the region and even beyond. Both possess large populations of disenfranchised residents, Palestinians for one and a mixture of expatriates and migrant workers for the other. Each also stands in its own way as a social, political and economic model for many around the world. The difference is that Israel plays the role of America's satrap in the region, if today only by laying waste to it, while the UAE cannot assume this position and must only hope to be treated reasonably well in the event Israel assumes hegemony over the Arab world. The loss of sovereignty does not make for peaceable relations of dependence, but leads to even more violence within and between states. Their weakness also serves as an invitation for external powers to intervene in the Middle East. Apart from Americans with their European and Israeli allies, these include non-Arab states in the wider region. The most important are Turkey and Iran, two large countries competing for hegemony with each other and Israel. Tempted by the region's apparently easy pickings, both have sought to create proxies, alliances and zones of influence within it, either to forestall threats from the insurgencies plaguing its weak states or to expand their own power over them. The outcome of such intervention, like those by the US, has been mixed at best. Interfering in a region lacking political integrity reinforces and indeed spreads violence there rather than containing it. This is because their proxies and partners are unable to serve such interventionist powers effectively. Their weakness is signaled by constantly shifting strategies, which therefore lack institutional depth. Saudi Arabia and the UAE may be partners against Yemen, Libya, Qatar or Sudan one day and rivals the next. They may shift from wanting Turkish to Pakistani protection. Only their American defense links possess any depth, and these have also proven inadequate in the war on Iran. Like all Arab states, those in the Gulf are internally fragile. Invested in preventing military coups from the top and popular uprisings from the bottom, they centralize power and weaken their own institutions in the process. Though provisioned with expensive military equipment, they do not trust their own armies, which are rarely deployed in conflicts such as the one with Iran today. The majority of their populations, or roughly half of it in Saudi Arabia, are made up of non-citizens and so cannot be counted upon to defend these states. Even to call the smaller Gulf principalities nation-states is questionable, as they are more like corporations or special economic zones. The most significant economic relations the Gulf monarchies have are with Asia, Europe or North America rather than the rest of the Middle East. This suggests that the region's lack of political integrity is compounded by the absence of its economic equivalent. All of which means that the efforts by external powers to redefine the region or claim hegemony over it result in them being pulled into a morass of ever-changing relations with no strategic depth. Iran's strategy of building an outer line of defense in the Arab world by way of allies like Hamas, Hezbollah and the Houthis ended up making them into liabilities that forced the Islamic Republic into a damaging war it had not planned on. Under their American security umbrella, many Arab states can pioneer new social models and generate great wealth despite lacking sovereignty. The Gulf monarchies, for example, are like Israel remarkably diverse societies, shaped by immigration while also housing an underclass that is desirable for the former but not the latter. Yet, like Lebanon, once also a success story as a pro-Western center of Middle Eastern banking, publishing and culture, these non-sovereign states can quickly collapse. Carved out of Syria by the French to give its Christian populations a significant voice in the new country, Lebanon even looked for some time like a more successful, if demilitarized, version of Israel. but Lebanon was unable to play the neutral role of the region's Switzerland. As a result of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, it came to house a large refugee population alongside the PLO expelled from Jordan in 1970. A state within the state, the PLO helped shift the demographic balance of the country to minoritize Christians. The civil war that followed set the stage for an Israeli invasion that resulted in the PLO's departure. It also permitted the rise to power of Shia movements and eventually Hezbollah, which took the political place of the PLO. Syria and Iran then came to influence Lebanese politics in competition with Saudi Arabia, while Israel repeatedly disrupted these relations militarily. Similar stories of state fragility, military intervention, and civil wars supported by external forces can be told about Iraq, Yemen, Libya, and Syria, each illustrating the region's lack of political integrity. While in the past these events might have had the movement of refugees and spread of terrorism as their main international consequences, today we see them exporting the loss of state sovereignty itself beyond the Arab world. The war on Iran was made possible by that in Gaza and has as its goal this dismantling of Iranian sovereignty to make it more like an Arab state. To raise the cost of war for its enemies, Iran retaliates against their bases and allies in the Gulf and Israel, but has so far not managed to deter them. The Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s, occurring simultaneously with the anti-Soviet war in Afghanistan, had already carried Arab politics and funding to the other side of the Persian Gulf. The subsequent war on terror in Afghanistan was also defined by Middle Eastern concerns regarding Al-Qaeda, and now in Iran we have yet another example of the way in which the violence proceeding from the Middle East's loss of sovereignty and lack of political integrity has expanded its reach in Asia. There, it can only lead to the further fragmentation of sovereignty, with consequences not only for Iran but other countries like Pakistan, Afghanistan, and even India. The best conclusion to the war for them all would be the survival and even strengthening of Iran's sovereignty. When Iqbal attributed the Palestinian problem to the emergence of Arab nationalism, he was himself a colonial subject. That allowed him to speak with authority about European imperialism, while also fostering a politics for which sovereignty was crucial. And yet Iqbal's vision of India as a future great power providing South Asia with political integrity never came to pass. Instead, he was claimed by the movement for a Muslim national home in India that opted for the kind of partition Iqbal had criticized in Palestine. But despite the subcontinent's division allowing outside powers like the Americans and Chinese to interfere in its affairs, both India and Pakistan remain fixated on preserving their sovereignty and have not turned South Asia into a version of the Arab world. Yet the war in Iran threatens to follow the Arab model in destabilizing parts of Asia and even the Caucasus. A much larger and economically more important country than Afghanistan, it may not be possible to manage or isolate Iran as the former has been. And the presence of American bases and troops in the country would compromise the autonomy of all its neighbors far more significantly than was the case in Afghanistan. The fact that such an occupation would be even more disastrous than that of Afghanistan is no consolation. No longer confined by its geography, Arab politics serves as both motor and model for a future that threatens the non-Western world with the loss of sovereignty and political integrity. Iran's survival is important because it represents the non-Western state's sovereignty and so the ability to secure and chart its own future. The comparison between the current war, now focused on Iran's control of the Strait of Hormuz, and the Suez Crisis of 1956 about Egypt's control of the canal is often made. While it is true that Suez marked the end of Britain's imperial power, just as Hormuz illustrates the limits of America's, there is a crucial distinction between them. The Anglo-French-Israeli attack on Egypt was halted by the Eisenhower administration, whereas Iran's state has so far prevented the US and Israel from overturning its sovereignty without having to fight an insurgency against occupation, as in Afghanistan, Iraq, and even Vietnam. Outside the familiar talking points of Euro-American debate, the war in Iran is not seen as being either about religious authoritarianism or nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles. Discussion is dominated instead by the importance of sovereignty at a time when the international order forged during the Cold War as part of a balance of power is coming apart. The loss of that balance with the collapse of the Soviet Union led to a unipolar moment characterized by the indiscriminate use of American violence in places like the Middle East, Southern Europe, and North Africa. Iran is the last of the Middle East's ideological states, emerging late during the Cold War and able so far to survive it as an industrial, scientific, and military power. In addition to permitting the expansion of American violence globally, the end of the Cold War also resulted in the promotion of economic globalization. And this made for the inadvertent rise of non-Western powers, particularly in Asia. Today, the US seeks to reassert its monopoly of violence internationally while dismantling the unequal benefits of globalizations with sanctions and tariffs. But the war in Iran tells us that it is already too late. President Trump is clearly concerned by the relative decline of his country's military and economic power, but he also serves as the most visible symptom of that decline, which he cannot therefore reverse. His war in Iran will either export the Arab model to strip yet more countries of sovereignty or destroy it.
To hear more podcasts from Tank, you can subscribe on all major podcast platforms or follow us on SoundCloud. The theme music for this podcast is by Himera.